Maybe this Earth is another planet's hell, says Aldous Huxley. Hello, good evening, and welcome to a new episode of Arguably the Reading Quest. I am Nishant. So, today, the book and the topic I am going to talk about is a very sad and horrendous history episode in the history of humanity, and that is the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust. And the book that I'm going to talk about is The Holocaust An Unfinished History by Dan Stone. Dan Stone is a professor of modern history and director of the Holocaust Research Institute at Royal Holloway, University of London. So, in this episode, I'll like to raise a few questions and ponder upon it, and we'll try to answer to these questions to an extent that, how did Holocaust really happen? I'd also like to argue that it was not only a Auschwitz-centric project, and there was no such thing as industrial Holocaust as is commonly misunderstood. What was the extent of collaboration across Europe? And then, why do we misremember it so egregiously? So, this book by Dan Stone is a vital history book that shatters many myths about the Nazi genocide. And in this process, I'd also like to refer to you a series of other books in connection to these books that will help you form a definitive idea about Holocaust and why do we misremember it. Right. So to start with, I'll again start with some of the quotes that have been quoted again and again. Whenever we talk of the Nazi genocide, the Holocaust, and in that sequence, I'll refer to those books from where I have taken those quotes. So, the quotes that I will evoke, that I'll recite, is taken from one of these books, the Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was one of the prominent philosophers who talked about the origins of totalitarianism, both the Nazi totalitarianism and the Stalinist totalitarianism, and the origin of totalitarianism in general. She is one who is oft quoted alongside with the famous George Orwell's novel 1984. So this is one book that is strongly recommended in context of today's topic. Another book that I would like to recommend is Miklos Nizhly. So he was a Holocaust survivor, a Nazi Holocaust survivor, a Jew, and the book title is A Doctor's Eyewitness Account. Auschwitz, A Doctor's Eyewitness Account. I'll put the link in the description box section as well, don't worry. Primo Levi, If This Is a Man, and The Truce. If This Is a Man and The Truce. Primo Levi committed suicide. It has been a topic of much unsettled debate whether the suicide was prompted by his trauma, a deep-seated trauma that he couldn't overcome. Some people say that yes, it was because of that. Some people say that no, it was just a casual accident. It's for you to decide, read and ponder. So Primo Levi, this one book is definitely recommended. I hope most of you might not have known about this book. This is by Henrik Ball, The Train Was on Time. So it talks about a soldier's story who was held captive and who arrived at Auschwitz concentration camp, packed in a train, as most of the Nazi, concentration camp victims experienced. Another book that comes to my mind is Elie Wiesel, Night. Born into a Jewish family in Romania, Elie Wiesel was a teenager when he and his family was rounded off by Nazis, and then he was again a concentration camp survivor. And then this is an inside survivor's account, and Night is one of the most personal and poignant account of the Holocaust, and it provides rare insight into the darkest side of human nature. This book. Man's search for meaning needs no introduction. I have quoted it in the philosophical novel series, though not a novel per se, and I have also quoted it in the self-help book and the Great Sham series section. Needs no introduction. So But largely, the episode, today's episode, will confine to the Holocaust, an unfinished history by Dan Stone. So this is the subject for today's episode. In an ever changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything was possible and that nothing was true. Mass propaganda discovered that its audience was ready at all times to believe the worst, no matter how absurd, and did not particularly object to being deceived because it held every statement to be a lie anyhow. The totalitarian mass leaders based their propaganda on the correct psychological assumption that under such conditions one could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day and trust that if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would refuse in cynicism. Instead of deserting the leaders who had lied to them, they would protest that they had known all along the statement was a lie and would admire the leaders for their superior tactical cleverness, says Hannah Arendt in The Origin of Totalitarianism. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, that is, the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, that is, the standards of thought, no longer exist, says Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt also coined a term, the banality of evil, to show that the people who participated or who were complicit in the Nazi concentration scheme of things were not extraordinarily exceptionally bad people. They were quite normal people like us. And that is why she coined the term the banality of evil. It were the common people who made the best Nazi. It were the common people who obeyed to the rules and the regulations and who believed in the propaganda of government, who were duty-bound people, who were family men. Those people made the best Nazi. She writes in a book, H-Men in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. The trouble with H-Men was one of the Nazi employees in the Hitler camp. So the trouble with H-Men was precisely that so many were like him, and that many were neither perverted nor sadistic. That they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and of our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all the atrocities put together. Just think about it. And one of the greatest advantages of the totalitarian elites of the 20th and the 30th century was to turn any statement of fact into a question of motive. And that is still happening. You know that. And then George Orwell writes the iconic line in his iconic and dystopian novel 1984. He writes, "Now I'll tell you the answer to my question. It is this. The party seeks power entirely for its own sake. We are not interested in the goods of others. We are interested solely in power, pure power. What pure power means you will understand presently. We are different from the oligarchies of the past in that we know what we are doing. All the others, even those who resemble ourselves, were cowards and hypocrites. The German Nazis and the Russian communists came very close to us in their methods, but they never had the courage to recognize their own motives. They pretended, perhaps they then believed, that they had seized power unwillingly and for a limited time, and that just around the corner there lay a paradise where human beings would be free and equal. We are not like that. We know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it. Power is not a means, it is an end. One does not establish a dictatorship in order to safeguard a revolution. One makes a revolution in order to establish a dictatorship. The object of persecution is persecution. The object of torture is torture. The object of power is power. Now you begin to understand me, says George Orwell in the novel 1984. Primo Levi says monsters exist, but they are too few in numbers to be truly dangerous. More dangerous are the common men, the functionaries ready to believe and to act without asking questions. Auschwitz is outside of us, but it is all around us in the air. The plague has died away, but the infection still lingers, and it would be foolish to deny it. Rejection of human solidarity, obtuse and cynical indifference to the sufferings of others, abdication of the intellect and of the moral sense to the principles of authority, and above all, at the root of everything, a sweeping tide of cowardice, a colossal cowardice which masks itself as wearing virtue, love of country, and faith in an idea, says Primo Levi in the book The Black Hole of Auschwitz. Even in this place, one can survive, and therefore one must want to survive, to tell the story, to bear witness, and that to survive we must force ourselves to save at least the skeleton, the scaffolding, the form of civilization. We are all slaves, deprived of every right, exposed to every insult, condemned to certain death, but we still possess one power, and we must defend it with all our strength, for it is the last, the power to refuse our consent, says Primo Levi. Neutrality helps the oppressors, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities became irrelevant. Whenever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, and political views, that place must at that moment become the center of the universe, says Elie Wiesel. Where is God? Where is He? Someone behind me asked. Here, me stands for Elie Wiesel. For more than half an hour, the child in the news stayed there, struggling between life and death, dying in slow agony under our eyes. And we had to look him full in the face. He was still alive when I passed in front of him. His tongue was still red. His eyes were not yet glazed. Behind me, I heard the same man asking, "Where is the God now?" And I heard a voice within me answer him, "Where is he? He is here. He is hanging here on his gallows," says Elie Wiesel. Even though the conditions such as lack of sleep, insufficient food, and various mental stress may suggest that the inmates were bound to react in certain ways, in the final analysis it becomes clear that the sort of person the prisoner became was the result of an inner decision, and not the result of camp influences alone. We who lived in the concentration camp can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken away from them except the last one, except one thing, the last of the human freedoms, and that is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way, says Viktor Frankl. But today's society is characterized by achievement orientation, and consequently it adores people who are successful and happy, and in particular it adores the young. Here there is a scathing criticism against what's wrong with this achievement oriented society, what's wrong with this cutthroat utilitarianism, what's wrong with this cutthroat competitive society. It is leading out to a burnout society, as most of the philosophers have pointed out, and Viktor Frankl drives home the point in this quote. It virtually ignores the value of all those who are otherwise, and in doing so, blurs the decisive difference between being valuable in the sense of dignity and being valuable in the sense of usefulness. If one is not cognizant of this difference and holds that an individual's value stems only from this present usefulness, then believe me, one owes it only to personal inconsistency not to plead for euthanasia along the lines of Hitler's program. That is to say, mercy killing of all those who have lost their social usefulness. Mercy killing of all those who have lost their social usefulness. Be it because of old age, incurable illness, mental disorientation, or whatever handicap they may suffer. Confounding the dignity of man with mere usefulness arises from the conceptual confusion that in turn may be traced back to the contemporary nihilism transmitted on many an academic campus and many an analytical couch, says Viktor Frankl's in Man's Search for Meaning. And then Viktor Frankl says that what is demanded of man, as some existential philosophers teach, to endure the meaninglessness of life is not, what demanded of man is not to endure the meaninglessness of life, but rather to bear his incapacity to grasp its unconditional meaningfulness in rational terms. Our generation is realistic, for we have come to know man as he really is. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright, with the Lord's Prayer on his lips. Since Auschwitz, we know what man is capable of. And since Hiroshima, we know what is at stake, says Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning. In a similar light, I would like to add, and please pardon me the long discourse, when an alternative history of philosophy from the perspective of evil would be written, as most of the philosophers have undertaken the task, Auschwitz is going to stand out. The Holocaust is going to stand out, not the Hiroshima, not the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You may ask me why. Because Hiroshima and Nagasaki still showed that what science is capable of doing if misused. Whereas the Holocaust showed us something that we human beings never have expected to discover. We expected that we would not have discovered such a horrendous side of humanity. So much so that some of the poets and philosophers often quoted that, they have asked a rhetorical question, and a rightful rhetorical question, rightfully so, that is it still ethical to talk about poetry and arts once Auschwitz has happened in the face of earth? Please think about it. The volume of literature on Auschwitz is so large and incomprehensible that one cannot help being overwhelmed with the volume of literature, especially if you simply read the history. The scholarship is so vast. And the reasons are very simple. A simplest reason is that Auschwitz is something that any thinking person would be concerned of. It is something that concerns every thinking soul. And if you think that it is a sign of overproduction, or if you see a hidden Jewish hand in it, then pardon me, you are again resorting to anti-Semitic rhetorics. So please, stand away from it. Now, I would like to, quote some of the passages verbatim from this book to help you understand what Dan Stone has to say. So in the introduction of What is Holocaust, Dan Stone says, and Dan Stone quotes a writer, Abel Herzberg, that there are no clean and unclean people. You see, the reference here is to Jew. At least, not in principle. There are no chosen nations. However, there are those who know of a dividing line between what is and what is not permitted, and others who not only do not know, but who do not want to know it either. Then, from the indictment of the Journal of the National Military Tribunal, published in the year 1946, 7 June, it quotes, and I recite, The program of action against the Jews included disenfranchisement, stigmatization, denial of civil rights, subjecting their persons and property to violence, deportation, enslavement, enforced labor, starvation, murder, and mass extermination. The extent to which the conspirators succeeded in their purpose can only be estimated. But the annihilation was substantially complete in many localities of Europe. Of the 9.6 million Jews who lived in the part of Europe under Nazi domination, it is conservatively estimated that 5.7 million Jews have disappeared, most of them deliberately put to death by the Nazi conspirators. In a diary that she kept in Bergen, the young Jewish Yugoslav, Hannah Levy Haas writes at one point of a boy whose body has been infested by fleas and who is rejected by his family. You listen to this poignant account. He couldn't kill the vermin that had settled on his body because he couldn't see them. They have burrowed deep into his skin and swarmed through his eyebrows. His chest is completely blackened by these fleas and their nests. We have never seen such a thing. We never imagined such a thing could occur. Everyone avoids him. His brothers and sisters dread his presence. His fleas, his howling. The other night he dragged his useless body from one bed to another. There are a lot of dots, begging people to make room for him. Everyone pushed him away in disgust. Painful story. His case is not unique. And then Dan Stone writes, this merging of animal and human, this deeply traumatic destruction of the self and the revulsion it causes amongst others who fear the same thing happening to them, is an extraordinary description. In it we glimpse the nightmarish consequences of Nazi persecution. And then Hannah Arendt, famous for writing The Origins of Totalitarianism and the Human Condition, famous for her work on the origins of totalitarianism, says, perhaps Holocaust was an attempt to eradicate the very concept of the human being. Ardent's radical claim reminds us that we have in some way either forgotten or ignored altogether what the Holocaust was and how devastating its effect were. The depth of the trauma caused by Holocaust means we must move beyond a mechanistic interpretation of industrial genocide is what the books attempt to shatters. There was no such thing as industrial genocide. The ubiquity of collaboration across Europe driven by coincidence of wants between the Nazis' ideologically driven aspiration to rid the world of Jews and the desire of many nation-state leaders to create ethnically homogeneous population means we need to stop thinking of Holocaust as a solely German project. It was, however, driven and largely perpetrated by Germans, including Austrians. Thus, we must focus on ideology understood as a kind of phantasmagorical conspiracy theory. And finally, we need to understand the ways in which the after effects of the Holocaust shaped the post-war years and continue to be felt today. And then, one of the most important passages. Thus, although the persecution of the Jews that led to the Holocaust was a German project, a point which cannot be overemphasized, it chimed with the programs of many European fascist and authoritarian regimes. Without the Germans' umbrella project, the Holocaust in Europe would not have happened, for sure, nor were its allies as obsessed with the world historical threat posed by the Jews as the Germans were, although some came close, especially certain figures in the Croatian, Romanian and the French leadership strata. But without the willing participation of the so many collaborators across Europe, the Germans would not have found it much harder to kill so many Jews. The Germans would have found it much harder to kill so many Jews. In Norway, France, and Hungary, local police rounded up, guarded, and deported Jews. In Slovakia, the impetus to deport Jews came from the indigenous clerical fascist regime rather than from the Germans. The same is true in the country of enlightenment. You see the hint of sarcasm here, the country of enlightenment, where French officials drafted the legislation and provided the manpower to arrest and deport Jews from France. The only country in Western Europe where Jews were deported from a zone that was not under direct German occupation. Finally, it is important to remember that Holocaust did not just end in May 1945 with the liberation of the camps. Rather, the remnants of European Jewry, shocked and angry, found themselves, with the exception of the small number of Western European Jews who could return home relatively easily, homeless, without families, community, and homelands. Jewish Poles who returned to Poland, many after spending the war's year as refugees in the Soviet Union, were subject to pogroms. Hungarian Jews who returned were met with incredulity and disdain by those who had stolen their apartments, their homes, their properties. Dutch Jews encountered resistance to their stories since the Dutch were consumed with their own during the hunger winter of 1944 1945. The creation of DP here stands for displaced person. The creation of DP camps in, of all the places, Germany and Austria, and to a smaller extent in Italy as well, and the incarceration of Jewish illegal migrants in Cyprus by the British left many Jewish survivors with a feeling that there was no future for them anymore in Europe, anywhere. Having expected help from the Allies to resettle where they wanted, their bitter disappointment at being detained further manifested itself in knee-jerk Zionism. Although some half of all survivors eventually found their way to US, Palestine became the destination of choice for most, at least in the first instance, and the creation of the State of Israel, in the context of a war in which a large proportion of soldiers were Holocaust survivors, followed in a sequence of events that might otherwise never have come to pass. And then, this is how it began: economic recession, protectionism, nativist movements promising to protect the nation, ultranationalism. When the policies deriving from this position end by making people poorer, more afraid of others, and more turned in on themselves, then their positions hardened and became more strident, since those promoting them can only explain their failure by claiming that they have been thwarted by an unseen hand. And what is this unseen hand? This unseen hand is the Jewish collaboration, invisible collaboration, and the Treaty of Versailles. Let's make Germany great again, and overcoming all the dictates of the Treaty of Versailles and decolonizing Germany, as was viewed by the Nazi supporters. The Holocaust is not a lesson about the dangers of bullying, nor even a tale of the dangers of hatred. It is a warning that states when elites became desperate to hold on to power can do terrible, traumatic things, that the deep psychology of modernity produces monster the likes of which even the sleep of reason would struggle to generate. I will return to these problems, says Dan Stone, which are more pressing now than at any time since historians began to write about the Holocaust at the end of the Second World War, later in this book. Now, what is the Holocaust? Holocaust title. Nazism emerged from the crisis of post-Great War Europe and the Great Depression. The Nazis thought of themselves as carrying out an anti-colonial struggle, that is to say, reversing the dictates of the Treaty of Versailles, and revealing it to have been the work of a hidden hand, as I told you, of international Jewry, meant, from the Nazis' point of view, freeing Germany from foreign control. The context of post-war violence, and not just in Germany's eastern borderlands, and the ways in which the Free Corps foreshadowed extra-legal military forces are crucial here, as is in general the impact of the First World War on European societies. For the first time, concepts such as statelessness, Refugee camps and the state of exception became unmissable fixtures on the European landscape, and the Bolshevik Revolution fueled the rise of fascism in Italy and elsewhere. Yes, it is the Bolshevik Revolution. The crisis of Weimar is usually written with the emphasis on the rejection of republic and the polarization of politics. But it was the economic depression after 1929 that proved crucial, since only after that date did Nazism in Germany rose to prominence. As the middle classes felt the ground shifting beneath their feet. Most importantly, Nazism was part of broader European trend and did not come from nowhere. Please mind it. Mass politics, unemployment, post 1918 violence, Italian fascism, anti communism, appeasement, and the underrating of Hitler and his ideas. Yes, the underrating of Hitler and his ideas, especially the importance of race, eugenics, traditional Christian Jew hatred, and its mutation into modern anti Semitism, the notion of fascism as a colonialism returned home. All of these contributed to the appeal of Nazism, which was not an explosion of collective madness with no links to anything that had gone before in the European history. Rather, it was very much present. Rather, Nazism was the most extreme manifestation of sentiments that were quite common, and for which Hitler acted as a kind of rainmaker or shaman. So the ground was already fertile, the ground was already ripe. Hitler only acted as a rainmaker or a shaman. And it would be nice if it were true that Nazism was simply a return of the barbarians. For then we could agree with Peter Vivek, who in 1941 argued that Nazism was an outgrowth of German Romanticism and concluded pithily, and I quote verbatim, the result is apes in evening dress, Neanderthals in bomb laden airplanes, very efficient and intelligent barbarians speeding debonairly in civilization's latest model motor cars, applying to uncivilized ends the highest technical achievements of civilizations. However, Nazism, as Hannah Arendt said, may have come from the gutter, but the gutter is also a part of the European civilization. What we now know as the final solution, the final solution, the infamous final solution, was arrived at through a series of steps, not a single decision, culminating in spring of 1942, when the program was recognizably in place. At this point, Jews were still not very relevant to the SS camp system, since they were being killed in face-to-face shootings in Eastern Europe or in death camps in Nazi-occupied Poland. The key year was 1942. In March, some 75 to 80% of the Holocaust's victims were still alive. Whereas by mid-Feb 1943, some 80% of the Holocaust victims were dead. The victims at this stage were primarily religious Eastern European Jews, and their struggles to comprehend what was happening to them are vitally important for showing how, just as there was not one form of persecution, so different people amongst the victim groups in different places responded different ways to attack on them. The Holocaust, however, was not a European phenomenon with many perpetrators, not just German. Collaboration is most obviously evident in countries such as France, Norway, Croatia, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, where killing Jews fitted with long held nationalistic aspirations to create ethnically homogeneous nation states. Among the clearest examples of collaboration are the Holocaust in Romania and the deportation of the Jews of Hungary in the spring 1944. The Holocaust has moved, as Jeffrey Alexander puts it, from war crime to trauma drama. And perhaps one of the most unedifying spectacles indicating the law of unintended consequences is the way in which an increased awareness of the Holocaust has led it to being banalized and exploited. Unsurprisingly, it remains a key topic of contestation from the radical right across the world and a barometer of political culture, whether in Israel or Poland. But perhaps most problematic is what we might call the beautifying of the Holocaust in the Western world. The lauding of survivors and their moving stories and a desire to learn from the Holocaust. The Holocaust teaches us nothing except that the deep passions that owe nothing to rational politics can move human being to do terrible things. Which is to say, the Holocaust teaches us nothing, since nothing in the end can stop people from supporting these dark forces in the times of crisis. That grim thought raises the question, what does the Holocaust tell us about modernity? The Holocaust was not the logical conclusion of the means and rationality, but rather the consequence of a modern world that creates and cancelizes deep passions that have no obvious outlet. In principle, there was nothing wrong with Holocaust education or Holocaust commemoration. But we should be willing to face the radical conclusions to which these activities should lead us, that the Holocaust was a deeply traumatic event for its victims, that the consequences of the Holocaust have not only led to good, the creation for the time being of a democratic Germany, the absence of war in most of the Europe post 1945, but have left a dark legacy, a deep psychology of fascination with fascism as well. That people turn to instinctively in moments of crisis, and that the Holocaust not only reveals the fragile identity but awesome power of the modern nation states and the pillars which supports it. And what are the pillars which support it? It is the rule of law, the military, religion, ruling elites, but also calls to their very organization and functioning into question. The Holocaust cannot be explained as a vicious action of a mad regime. It has political, religious, cultural, and social implications for the modern societies, and that is why its impact is so keenly felt, even if public commemorative ceremonies rarely articulates its significance in these terms. In this book, I show what these implications are and why the Holocaust is not just a lesson about intolerance or hatred, but tells us how societies in crisis can slide into horror, with the majority, including stabilist elites, colluding the worst sort of crimes if they sense that their positions might otherwise be threatened. In this book, says Dan Stone, my focus on ideology is not meant to suggest a simplistic belief in an idea into actions model. It is not the case that because Hitler wrote diatribes against the Jews in Mein Kampf, that the Jews of Europe were murdered. At the same time, there is a connection between Hitler's statement and the genocide of the Jews. I suggest that in context of the interwar crisis in Europe, which allowed Hitler's idea to gain support, Jews functioned as a symptoms of modernity that fascism was designed to overcome. And what was the symptom of modernity? Rootlessness, cosmopolitanism, universality, loss of community, rapid change, standardization, and soullessness. This was the ideological framework in which Holocaust took place, which is not the same thing as saying that a plan to murder the Jews existed in 1933 or even in 1940. Nazi anti Semitism attacked an abstract concept, and that abstract concept was the Jews. That was, the Nazis believed the embodiment of everything that was wrong with modernity. In turn, this held to the murder of some 6 million individuals because they were, according to Nazis' definition, Jewish. That is why the focus here is on the Jews. At last, I quote the last paragraph from the conclusion, and for you to read the book yourselves and understand it. The Romanian French fascist philosopher E.M. Coiron wrote in one of his suavely provocative and cheerfully glib end of time pronouncements that our capital of misery remains intact throughout the ages. Yet we have one advantage over our ancestors, that of having invested our capital better, since our disaster is better organized. Can we say with certainty that he was wrong? Now, I would like to add one more thing. Can we say with certainty that education helps us reach the liberation? Can we help with certainty that the educated class will not be complicit to the fascist forces? I have my own cynicism in place, and rightfully so. Apart from many other things that we have discussed in this episode, one last thing that I would like to add is that if we talk of top 10 philosophers that a world has ever produced, top 6 are Germans. Need I name them? Yes, let me name it to you. Immediately after Plato and Aristotle, the name comes to my mind is Immanuel Kant, and objectively speaking, so Immanuel Kant. We have After Immanuel Kant, we have Schopenhauer. After Schopenhauer, we have Immanuel Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Karl Marx, Feuerbach, Nietzsche. We have Sigmund Freud. We have Heidegger and Husserl. Who has read more than Germans? What Germany has not read at the time of Holocaust? But it was Holocaust that happened in Germany and not anywhere else. That puts a big question mark on the education itself. Is education a progressive discovery of our ignorance? If yes, why we have failed in Germany? Why did Holocaust happen in Germany? That is for me to ask and you to ponder. Happy reading, all of you. If you have still not liked, shared, and subscribed my YouTube channel, Arguably the Reading Quest, please do that. I am also on Instagram now with the same page, Arguably the Reading Quest. You can follow us at Instagram as well. Happy reading. Thank you, guys.